to have with us once again expert military and geopolitical analyst Colonel Douglas McGregor. Colonel McGregor is, of course, all over social media, but most particularly, you'll see him as a frequent guest of Tucker Carlson's, and he's here to help us make some sense of what's actually turning into a very complicated and potentially very cataclysmic clash that's already engulfing much of the world. So, Colonel, welcome back. It's an honor, as always, to have you. Well, thank you very much. So, let's set the stage here. I know we were all shocked by what happened on October 7th. There's no question on that, and of course, there's no question that a sovereign nation like Israel has a right to defend itself. But I think what more and more people are getting very concerned about is that this righteous rage, as it were, is being used as a green light for Israeli forces to unleash hell against Hamas with seemingly no consideration either by the Israelis or by the political class in D.C. of the indescribably disastrous consequences that can result from such unrestrained green lighting. Is that, in your estimation, an accurate frame for understanding the big picture of what's unfolding in front of us? Oh, yes. I think that's a good way to begin the discussion. And we could spend hours describing the problems in the region, particularly in Gaza and Israel, that led to these tragic events of 7th October. That's almost unimportant compared with what you're discussing, and that is the implications for what's happening right now. The largest problem is that we in the West, and I say probably more accurately the United States and to a lesser extent Israel, do not understand how profoundly different the region is today from what it was in 1973. I was in Israel when they celebrated the 40th anniversary of the 1973 war, and things were really quite different then. You had a very low level of literacy in places like Egypt. You had very confused leadership in both Syria and Egypt. There was no sense of unity whatsoever in the Muslim world. Many of the states that today are really major powers were at the time simply developing, pulling themselves out of the past and into the present. So, that's part of our problem. The second part is that we in Washington, in particular, seem to regard ourselves as permanently stuck in the aftermath of 1991. I hear people all the time saying, "Look what we did in Desert Storm." Well, they don't really understand what happened, but we'll set that aside. More importantly, they don't understand that our forces, the structure of our forces, everything has deteriorated since 1991. People ask, well, what happened to all of that money? It's a little late to ask, but I think that those questions should have come up earlier, but people rushed to spend because that was a way to also line their pockets. If you're sitting on the hill, you spend, and the spending, you're told, is going to produce military power, and so, oh, it's great. You know, money in equals military power coming out. It doesn't work that way. So, there was very little accountability or what I would call informed supervision or oversight. So, an awful lot of that was wasted, and in the meantime, the forces have shrunk in size. Certainly, the last 2.5 years of this administration have been devastating for the armed forces, particularly the Army and the Marines. Huge problems inside those forces, divisive issues, divisive policies. So we are not today remotely as we were in 1991. We are a great power, to be sure. We may be the leading great power, but we are not the only great power. So that's the first thing. The second thing is everyone seems to miss the point that we've exhausted our war stocks. You know, we have little to fall back on because we've been feeding everything into the fire in Ukraine. All to do that has produced nothing for us and nothing for the American people. I would add nothing for the Ukrainian people, and Russia, which began with a very small force that was never designed to do more than just protect Russia, now sits on top of one of the largest and most capable forces in the world, and that has an impact on our thinking now, or it should as we go forward. Those are the big issues for Washington, but we really don't understand the gravity of Israel's actions. No one disagrees with or disputes Israel's views and feelings as a result of what happened on the 7th of October. That goes without question. And there are lots of examples in history where things like this have happened and produced outrage that resulted in revenge attacks. We certainly felt that way after Pearl Harbor. Our war with the Japanese during World War II was horrendous. There's a reason we didn't take very many prisoners, and it wasn't always because no one would give up. I mean, let's reflect. It was a terrible, terrible war. But those things could always still happen to us today. We have to guard against it. But right now, we have a situation where the Israelis are emoting. We are emoting. And we have this relationship that exists between every great power and every small power. When you allow yourself or commit yourself to a smaller power, you run the risk that the smaller power will try to leverage you. War against people that under normal circumstances you would prefer not to fight. Right. That's not about whether we like them or not. In most cases, war is not a good idea. I know that's a revolutionary statement in today's America. We've become so accustomed to using the word war and pretending that war is something on somebody else's soil. Right. Well, this is a war that will come and visit us as well. And that's why we need to think carefully about it. So, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll try to work through the strategic consequences of various actions. Just as you're speaking, I was listening to Alexander McCurry over at the Duran, who said he had just had a great observation. Neocons only seem to know how to escalate: more money, more weapons, more threats, more countries to threaten. You know, there just appears to be no sense of any semblance of de-escalation among the particular neocons in DC or in Brussels for that matter. But I think what I'm hearing you say, what makes this particularly alarming, is that propensity towards escalation has spread into Tel Aviv now, with an official of the Netanyahu government promising to wipe Lebanon off the face of the earth. It has belonged. If Lebanon gets involved, it seems that the two major parties involved here in terms of the West versus the rest, US and Israel, they're only thinking in escalating terms, and that doesn't end well, does it? Well, right now, Mr. Netanyahu thinks that he has a unique opportunity to leverage American military power in a fight to destroy all of Israel's enemies. This is no longer just about Israel versus Hamas. The Gaza problem has been there for a long time. This gave him the opportunity to appeal to the Israeli nation and say it's time for us to erase Gaza. And so he is planning to go into Gaza and not simply remove the population. He will expel whatever he can, but anything that is not expelled will be killed. So this is a scorched earth operation. And people have to understand, especially in this urban environment in Gaza City, when you send soldiers in there, Israeli, American, British, whatever they are, your predisposition is to shoot first and ask questions later. You're not going to fiddle around with somebody who sticks his head up and ask whether or not he's part of Hamas or she's part of Hamas. You're simply going to fire. So this is the worst kind of situation you can imagine. And he's been very vocal about his determination to essentially wage this scorched earth policy against Gaza. This has, to put it mildly, enraged the entire Muslim world. So he's no longer looking at containing the conflict to Gaza. In fact, I think he's quite prepared to expand it, thinking that with our assistance, we can take on anybody who challenges him and win. I think it's a big mistake because I don't think we can do that. That's the 1991 thinking. Well, yeah, but in 1991, if we did anything right, we carefully isolated Iraq. Right. Iraq had no friends. No one was going to intervene on behalf of Iraq. Hamas is a reprehensible organization. True. But when you start to be seen as killing Arabs, Muslims simply because they happen to be there, no matter what your rationale for doing it happens to be, that changes everything. And the people in Gaza have a lot of potential support across the entire region and potentially beyond. Now, let's stop and think. Years ago, no one ever mentioned Turkey. In fact, even now in the United States, very few people bring it up, which is a mistake. Because what we've seen over the last 20 years in Turkey is a gradual retrenchment of what I would call Ottoman culture and Turkish nationalism. The Turkey of Ataturk. Yeah. The secular experiment. Yeah. Is gone. Yeah. For all intents and purposes, in Spanish. They still pay tribute to him, and they see him as a hero, but let's face it. This Turkey has moved in directions that are absolutely counterproductive from the standpoint of the stuff of Kemal. He wanted to, if anything, not only modernize Turkey, but he wanted to Europeanize it. He wanted to thoroughly cleanse it of any form of religious nationalism and separate church from state. Yeah. Doing it in a Latin-based alphabet and everything. Yeah. That's being reversed, and we have to understand that the Turks, over many, many years, have built an extraordinarily sophisticated and capable military establishment, and unlike everybody else in the region, they have a long martial history. The Turks are excellent soldiers, first-class soldiers. They have a good officer corps, and this officer corps, as opposed to what existed 10 years ago or 20 years ago, is fiercely loyal to Erdogan and his vision. And then, finally, Turkey has always had close relations with Pakistan, and that goes back many, many years for different kinds of reasons. But the point is that Pakistan has always made it clear to the Turks that if they should need a nuclear weapon, wow, Pakistan will provide it. And that has now been repeated publicly in the Pakistani parliament. So, you know you're not dealing with the Turkey of 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, all of these states have changed. You have a much more literate, much more informed population. Social media reaches everyone. Yep. Someone was asking me about this riot at the airport in Dagestan, which is a province of Russia. Russia. The people that live in Dagestan are Turks. We sometimes refer to them as Turkic. What Americans don't understand, and most people in the West don't understand, is that from the borders of Mongolia and Kazakhstan in the east, all the way to the Mediterranean with very few exceptions. The only one I can think of is Tajikistan. They all speak effectively the same language as Mr. Erdogan. Yep. The Tatars who live in Crimea can read and listen to Erdogan's talks. Right. They can tune him in. They can tune him in all over Central Asia. They are hearing what he's saying. Right. And they are furious. Now, as it turned out, there were no Israelis on that plane. Yeah. In fact, when they got there, they discovered one Uzbek who got off. I'm sure he's not very happy about it. Uzbeks speak the same language, for all intents and purposes, as Americans. Right. And all of these were part of the former Turkish Mongolian hordes. I mean, when Genghis Khan led his armies into action, 50% of his army was usually Turkish or Turkic. Yes. Okay, so we don't understand that. Right. And what we witnessed was not some sudden outburst of anti-Semitism. You can go across Central Asia and find Jews, and the Jews there are not harmed by anyone. It was all focused on Israel and what they're hearing through the media from people like Erdogan. And that's hugely important. Erdogan is not just a blowhard. I've heard people say he couldn't be serious. Are you out of your mind? Right. It is deadly serious. And what he's been doing by moving 100 Turkish naval vessels in a massive display of Turkish naval power through the Bosporus is not an accident. The Turks can field a large navy, large air forces. They have a base on Cyprus. They can reach everything in the region with their weapon systems. And for the first time, the Israelis have done something that no one's been able to do in 1,000 years. They've united Shia and Sunni against them. Yeah, I was just going to bring up we've got the Arab-Sunni side of the equation there, but what about the Persian Shiite side of the equation with Hezbollah threatening and overtly threatening Iran? They've just united 80% and 20% together of the Islamic world. It's stunning. And then you'll be worried about Iran as everybody looks at Iran. Well, that's a backward place, and people there don't know anything. You know, you're talking about they have an elite class of very bright people that have come together just as they have in Russia, by the way, under Putin, to produce some remarkable technological achievements, particularly in theater ballistic missiles and also in these unmanned systems that we've seen operate in Russia. So the point is that you're dealing with two very powerful states, populations of 80 to 90 million. Think about the fact that 60% or more of the population is under the age of 30, but you're talking about fielding enormous armies, and some people say, well, armies don't make any difference, you can destroy them all. Well, I've got news for you. If you think armies don't make any difference, you don't understand warfare because they can be moved in various ways very quickly, and they have a lot of good equipment, especially from the Turkish side, that can travel the distance between the Turkish border and the Golan Heights very quickly. You know you can drive from the Turkish border down to the Golan Heights in perhaps 12 hours. Wow! And if you're an Israeli, one of the things that you worry about is exactly that, because if the enemy closes with you on your borders, how can you use the nuclear weapon unless you plan to commit suicide? Right, exactly. Yeah. And Hezbollah, of course, is sitting right there on the border with Israel. The interesting thing is that Hezbollah took a lot of casualties defeating the Sunni Islamists in Syria, working with not only Iran but also Mr. Assad and his government and Russians. And Hezbollah is much larger, much more sophisticated, much better armed than Hamas, and if you consider the damage that Hamas has inflicted so far, it's a fraction of what Hezbollah could do. Right. My great concern is that at some point, Hezbollah is going to launch, and they're going to launch because they're going to discover that what the Israelis are doing right now, instead of staging a massive invasion all at once, they're moving incrementally and deliberately. That's so that they minimize their own casualties, which makes a lot of sense, but it also tends to mislead the viewing audience to think, oh well, they're not really going in, are they? Oh yes, they will go in. I know the IDF, when they get a mission and are told to do it, they will do it to the best of their ability. Now, are they all excited about it? As I pointed out, this urban warfare is really terrible and exacts a high price from its participants. So, no, I don't think they are, and they will use a lot of firepower to spare their soldiers' lives as much as possible, but in the meantime, people are figuring it out, and I think Hezbollah will attack. We are supposed, according to public statements, to intervene and attack Hezbollah to take the burden off the Israeli Air Force so that it could continue to function on Gaza. I would fully expect an open rebellion or revolt on the West Bank in Palestine by the Palestinian Arabs who are there. That hasn't happened yet, but I would expect it. And then I would expect enormous pressure in Egypt on the government and say, what are we doing to help these people in Gaza? Why don't we intervene to stop the mass murder of the Arabs in Gaza? And I think that pressure will result in Egypt's intervention into the conflict. At that point, I think you're going to have Mr. Erdogan, who will show up and tell General Sisi, I'm here. Let me know what you need. I'll do everything I possibly can. I would expect Iran to do something similar. Syria, of course, is effectively already in the fight. We have 1,000 soldiers sitting up in the eastern corner of Syria, which Donald Trump rightly wanted to get out, and he was. And they didn't listen to him, right? They rebelled. No, they listened. They disobeyed. Oh, disobeyed. There you go. There you go. Yeah. And he wanted to get us out of Iraq as well. All of our troops in Iraq and in Syria are going to be under a very severe threat because, again, the Turks and the Iranians are far more powerful than any of their Arab neighbors. They can actually execute complex operations with missiles and ground forces and so forth. Then there's the problem of us sitting at sea. Now, I'm sure that we will sit a long way from Israel. That would be the intelligent thing to do to prevent our vessels from being easily attacked, but that's also very difficult when pilots are trying to deliver ordnance against targets in southern Lebanon. Especially if they're flying from somewhere west of Greece almost to Sicily. Now, after he delivers his ordnance, he's got to refuel. He may have to land in Israel. We don't know what the conditions in Israel will be in terms of rockets and missiles falling. In the meantime, however good the claims may be about the performance of Iron Dome, the numbers of projectiles, the numbers of things falling on the Israelis are simply too great to stop. In other words, you're going to break through any air defense system that can be overwhelmed if you fire enough missiles and so forth at it, then eventually destroyed. We've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen it in the Donbass. This is a fact of life in war. And then there's the issue of how much more can we ship when they need it. We've already diverted 155mm ammunition from Ukraine to Israel, which of course makes infinite sense. But then again, Ukraine is in ruins. We've made a terrible mess of that. Yeah. And my great fear, and what I wrote about in the American Conservative when I wrote this op-ed saying avoiding Armageddon is at the end of this process. I don't want Israel to look like Ukraine. Destroy. Right. Right. And I'm afraid that no one will intervene to stop any of this. And the way you stop it is very straightforward. Most American presidents, when they thought the Israelis were going too far that might precipitate a larger problem, have intervened and said stop. That's enough. Pull back. Most recently during the 73 war. We said that's enough if you've crossed the Suez Canal, get back on the other side. And they did. And we got a good agreement ultimately and have had good relations between Israel and Egypt all these years. In fact, we know the Egyptians did warn the Israelis about what eventually happened in Gaza. So, when is someone going to stand up and say, look, we love Israel, but unconditional support for an action in Gaza that could precipitate a regional war? Right. Drag us in but will probably destroy Israel doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And the irony is, isn't this exactly what Hamas wants? They want to be at the heart of the very center of the worldwide Islamic unification, and doesn't that mean then that Israel and the United States at this point in their reactions are giving Hamas exactly what they always wanted? Well, I can't provide you with tangible concrete proof of strategic genius in Hamas. That may be on somebody's minds. I think they may have underestimated the impact of their operation as well. HM. I don't think we can say that. I don't. Okay. It could work out that way. I think, Steve, let's be frank. I mean, it certainly looks bad. Yeah. It certainly looks like the Israelis are about to jump into a giant bear trap. There's no question about it. But the good news that if we were able to intervene now and say, look, you've got to stop. No more. Hold back. If you don't hold back, we will withdraw our forces. You tell that to the Israelis, they'll stop. Right. Because right now, they are confident that they have unconditional support to do whatever they want to do, and we don't do that. No. I mean, that was the great failure in 1914 with the German emperor. Right. He said, well, if that's what the Austrians want to do, we're bound to support them. Let them do it. Insane. You're right. He should have said outrageous. We're not going to war with Russia and France over Serbia. Right. You and, of course, the Russians should never have intervened and should have told the Serbs, behave. Stop being idiots. I'm not taking Russia into the war over Serbia. Nobody did it. And we had the First World War. We don't want to go through that. And then finally there's this point. We gotta keep this in mind. Iran has supported Russia throughout this entire process with Ukraine. Russia is not going to abandon Iran. Iran! Right. If we decide to attack it with the goal of destroying Iran, which is what I hear in Washington all the time, we will ultimately end up confronting Russia, and the Russians are obviously going to do business with the Turks. They're not normal friends or allies, but under the circumstances, why should they hold back? And this is one of the things I've said: the Israelis made a big mistake when they decided to suddenly turn and support this corrupt criminal regime in Kiev. They've stuck with Moscow. Moscow is being very good to the Israelis. Right. Has always accommodated them, gone out of his way to do so, told the Iranians if they come into Syria, they're targets, and he's not going to stop it. He turned off the air defense systems for us when we insisted that we wanted to launch cruise missiles, even though they told us it was stupid and it made no sense, and they were right, but they said fine. If that's what you want to do, we'll accommodate you. Why would you destroy that relationship with a major power? But Mr. Netanyahu and his government did that. It's now coming back to them. The Russians aren't going to go out of their way for the Israelis. So then finally, who else is left? Well, you have India and China. And right now they're quite happy to do business with the Israelis, and so are the Chinese, but under the circumstances not right now and maybe not again as a result of this terrible war. And the Chinese have already said that since we talk constantly about destroying China, we go into this nonsense about war with China or China, China, China. So the Chinese are saying, well, we're going to back these Russians because essentially we're on the menu. In other words, everything we've done, and I'm afraid the Israelis right now, has been strategically suicidal. Yeah. Just turn the entire world against us. Yeah. And then at the same time, you've got the problem in France and Germany and Scandinavia who've taken in all these Muslims, which was a mistake, from the Middle East and Africa. You can't assimilate these people, and they're very open about it. They've come here to reproduce and drive you out and take your country. So what an ugly set of circumstances. I can't imagine anything worse. I guess if you give me some time, I might come up with we can't handle it. And then we're looking at this in the United States, and people are saying to me, where did all these Muslims come from? Well, haven't you paid any attention to immigration? Exactly. Everybody's asleep. Nobody. Exactly. I mean, go out on the 5th of May and see the celebrations. Yeah. Well, yeah, you have open borders. You inevitably invite the world's conflicts. Yep. Exactly. And so we're sitting on our own powder keg as well, and this, sacrificing Israel on the altar of stupidity doesn't make sense. No, we've already done that, and I think Israelis are co-conspirators. They're so full of anger and hate, and they think they've got so much control over us that we'll do whatever we're told, right? And right now I guess we have no leadership, but this isn't going to last. What's Europe doing in all of this? I mean, they were so loud and on the forefront of the disastrous campaign in Ukraine, but they seem to be totally missing in action here with the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Well, I would tell you that in Europe the governments there are going to be replaced. It's already begun. It's already started, yeah. And they're all swinging hard to the right. Yep, far right. Hard to the right in Europe means no war with Russia. Thank you very much. Right. And everybody knows that Putin is not marching further west. He has no appetite. He's quite happy with what he's got. He's sitting in the Russian areas where people speak Russian or Russian. I'm sure he's going to move to take Kharkov and probably Odessa. Yes, I am soon or during the winter. They're historically Russian cities as the rest of it. He doesn't want to govern Ukrainians. He doesn't want to govern Poles. That's pretty sure. Absolutely not. That's a losing proposition. But he's not going to sit there and watch us in Washington turn Western Ukraine into this platform for an attack against Russia. That's off. So I mean, if you push him hard enough, yes, he'll cross the river, he'll do it, but that's not what he wants. He'd rather have a settlement that neutralizes the rest of Ukraine and be done with this and go back to doing business. Right. Because everybody in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. Right. Europeans are now looking at the problem they have in their country. And they're saying, we've made terrible mistakes. Now for the first time we hear Schultz in Germany, it's too late for him. He's scheduled for elimination. But he's now saying, well, we're going to deport these people. Yeah, well. Yeah, right. Or 5 or 6 million of them. Is the alternative for Deutsche of the AfD just as fast becoming the most popular party in Germany right now? Yeah, and in all they've ever said, by the way, this is not some radical bunch at all. All they've ever said is, look, we don't want to go to this war with Russia. We don't see it makes any sense, and why are we destroying our societies by inviting all these foreigners in? Exactly. That's their basic message. Right. That's far right today. Correct. Yeah, well, anything that you say that opposes whatever the exactly. It's racist. It's bigoted. And of course here we have no two-party system. You have a uni-party. Uni-party. And the uni-party wants all of these things, and you have a little group of Republicans over on the side that say they're, well, I'm in the Freedom Caucus, so it doesn't mean much because some of those people are nuts, frankly. Right. I've heard them stand up, but we have to join the war for Israel against the world. Yeah. So if we need to get the Israelis to back off and work out a solution that keeps Israel alive. Right. That's number one. Now let's sacrifice everything in a war we don't want to fight. And then secondly, you've got a lot of people on the far left, and they really are violently anti-Israeli. And if you go further and say anti-Semitic, yeah, probably applies to them. But you know you can cope with a lot of things, but you can't cope with this Uniparty. No. Uniparty is impregnable and invincible right now. And they are running the show, and there are more. There's probably, I don't know if our friend President Biden really knows what's going on, to be blunt. Right. But Joe Biden in the past was never enthusiastic about this sort of thing. Right. He wasn't. So I'm not sure he's doing much more but reading what he's put in front of him. Exactly. That's the cue cards that they give him. Yep. And then everybody else, all they're concerned about are campaign contributions. Contributions to the donors. Lobbies. And he lobbies that are happy with these wars. Oh yeah. So it's a lot of money. A lot of money that ends up in their pockets. Americans are not going to be very happy as the financial crisis that we've already started in gets worse. Right. These wars are going to force this implosion sooner than it might otherwise happen. I don't think the people in Washington are thinking it through. I think they assume that the Fed can continue to print money in perpetuity and no one will care. But they're not looking at reality. No one wants to buy our treasury bonds right around the world. That's right. And if we don't have people buying our debt, we can't spend the way we've been spending. Well, who's going to pay for all this? Right. We know the pension funds. Yeah, they own so much of the marketplace. Americans, the people that think they're going to retire someday, good luck with that plan on circumstances. Yeah. So speaking of a failed regimes, as it were. Just what's your opinion on the two-state solution? I mean, most of the world seems to want that. Biden reiterated the two-state solution. Go back to 1967 borders. Israel said that's an insult right now. I mean, I know they're speaking blustery at this point, but what's your, is it dead? Is it something that we're given the strength of 85% of the world's population, a more multipolar world? Is a two-state solution inevitable? What's your view? Right now, I can't say that anything is inevitable, although I'm worrying, as I told you to begin with, that Israel may not survive this event if it balloons and expands to the way it is right now. I think the two-state solution was always problematic for many years because the Israelis decided that if this is allowed to happen, we'll end up with the equivalent of an organized crime state on our borders. There will be a constant threat to us. So to make the two-state solution work, there has to be some guarantee of some kind to the Israelis that whatever emerges is not dangerous to Israel in the way that the Russians refuse to tolerate anything in western Ukraine that will be dangerous to them. That's the best I can say. But right now, if we don't intervene soon, Steve, I'm afraid that so much blood will be spilled. So much hate will be engendered. That a reasonable solution at the end will become damn near impossible. Right, for another 2 or 3 generations. Absolutely. Given that average age. Assuming that the Israeli state survives. Right. You add Turkey and Iran into this, and then you have the Russians behind them with potentially the Chinese as well. Right. And you look at our fragile financial system, and I would argue our fragile armed forces. Yes. Unless you think administration is suddenly going to say, well, we're going to have to draft. We're going to have to raise million-man armies and ship everybody in the Middle East on it. I don't think so. Yeah, you'll lose the 30 and under vote overnight, literally, yeah. I think it'll work. Yeah, exactly. Can't sustain that economy. Colonel, you're the CEO of our country, our choice organization. Amazing organization, gang. There's a link down below for you to click on to check it out. It seeks to create an American foreign policy, America First foreign policy that benefits the American people as well as face a number of other challenges to our nation's security and prosperity. Of an amazing Twitter feed that people should definitely subscribe to, where you comment all kinds of things. What can the average American just watching us today do to help prevent this tide of war from the Uniparty? Well, One of the things that you can try and do is let your congressman or senator, regardless of how much they disagree with you and how desperate they are to go to war in the region, and there are a lot of foolish people that think it was a great idea to go to war with Iran, and it's not. All you can do is register your opposition. Phone calls, emails, whatever you can do. They do make a difference. Numbers of people make a difference. Our biggest problem, Steve, as you know for many, many years, is that people have just ignored what's going on. It's back to this comment. Well, how did all of these Muslims get into the country? You're right. It's like, what planet are you on? Well, these people have been living on planet luxury. Yeah. And then they become complacent, and all of a sudden they're watching the world they think existed vanish. Yeah. They're living in a new world. You know why I was so tired? Well, we're the superpower. Are you out of your mind? Did you listen to the President of the United States? Oh gosh. Yeah. That speech. Oh my. He sounds like we just hit Pearl Harbor, and yeah. We're mobilizing the fight. No. Exactly. This is a new world. That's not what we're dealing with. That's not the world we're living in. But Americans have to become engaged, and our country, our choice, wants to unite Americans across party lines because we say, well, vote for Republicans. Vote for Democrats. Vote for nothing changes. Nothing changes. And there are more things that unite us that we don't talk about than divide us. We're so focused on what divides us. So in our country, our choice, we focus on things that unite us with the goal of building a movement that can turn this ship whose steering is broken into a new direction on every level. At home as well as abroad. And we want peace abroad because without peace abroad, it's very hard to build prosperity here at home. Exactly. At home. Exactly. At home. Exactly.